What would you do if saving a stranger's life on Christmas Eve revealed secrets that could destroy everything you thought you knew about your past? Tonight's story takes us deep into the frozen mountains of Montana, where a widowed mechanic's simple act of kindness spirals into a deadly game of survival, hidden identities, and a truth so dangerous that powerful forces will kill to keep it buried. Before we dive into this incredible journey of courage and redemption, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss how this story unfolds. Give this video a thumbs up if you're ready for an emotional roller coaster that will challenge everything you believe about justice and second chances. And let me know in the comments, would you risk everything to save a stranger's life? Now let's begin our story in the snow-covered mountains of Montana, where Christmas Eve is about to become the most dangerous night of one man's life. She is not who you think she is. Widowed mechanic rescues mysterious woman from deadly crash, then discovers her shocking identity. The cemetery stood like a frozen cathedral under the Montana sky, its weathered headstones jutting from the snow like broken promises reaching toward heaven. Marcos Steele pulled his battered Ford pickup to a stop beside the rusted gate, the engine's death rattle echoing across the silent valley like a prayer for the dying. Through the windshield, fat snowflakes danced in the amber glow of his headlights, each one a tiny messenger from the storm brewing overhead. "Daddy, why does it feel so sad here?" Luna's voice was barely a whisper from the passenger seat, her words carrying that uncanny perception that had marked her as different since the day she was born. At 9 years old, she possessed an otherworldly sensitivity to the emotions that lingered in places, a gift her mother Elena had called heartsight. Yeah. Tonight, surrounded by monuments to loss and grief, that gift was singing a particularly melancholy song. "Places remember feelings, sweetheart," Marcus said softly, his own eyes sweeping the darkness beyond the cemetery's borders with the trained caution of a man who had learned that danger could emerge from any shadow. "This is where people come to say goodbye to the ones they love. Those feelings, they stay." Luna nodded solemnly, her dark hair catching the dashboard's green glow. She clutched a small bouquet of grocery store carnations against her chest, white ones because she insisted that Mommy's favorite color was the color of snow angels and fresh beginnings. Marcus killed the headlights and sat for a moment in the sudden darkness. 3 years. 3 years since the cancer had taken Elena, and still these monthly pilgrimages felt like walking across broken glass in bare feet. The grief had evolved from the sharp cutting pain of fresh loss to something deeper and more persistent, a chronic ache that colored every moment, every decision, every breath. But Luna needed this ritual, needed to feel connected to the mother she barely remembered, except through photographs and the stories Marcos told her. And he would move heaven and earth to give his daughter whatever peace she could find, even if it meant confronting his own demons in this place where memory and loss walked hand in hand. The wind howled across the valley like a living thing, rattling the truck's windows and sending ice crystals spiraling through the air in hypnotic patterns. Weather reports had been screaming about the incoming blizzard for days, warning travelers to stay off the mountain roads. But Marcos had insisted on making this trip. Christmas Eve was Elena's birthday, and some promises couldn't be broken, not even by Mother Nature's fury. "Ready, little star?" he asked, using the pet name that always made Luna's eyes light up with warmth. She nodded and carefully adjusted the flowers in her lap, her small hands moving with the precise care of someone who understood that some gestures were sacred. "I wrote Mommy a letter," she announced with the matter-of-fact tone that characterized most of her profound observations. "It's about the butterfly we found last summer, the one with the broken wing that we helped fix." Marcos's throat tightened around words he couldn't speak. Even in death, Elena continued to teach their daughter about healing, about finding beauty in damaged things, about the possibility of flight after falling. "She'll love hearing about that." He managed, his voice rough with emotion he tried to keep hidden. They climbed out into the biting wind, Marcos immediately moving to Luna's side to shield her from the worst of the storm's fury. The snow crunched under their boots as they made their way through the cemetery's winding paths, their breath forming ghostly clouds that the wind snatched away before they could fully form. Elena's grave sat on a small rise overlooking the valley, marked by a simple granite stone that read, "Elena Maria Steele, beloved wife and mother, she found magic in ordinary moments." Marcus had chosen those words carefully, knowing that Elena's greatest gift had been her ability to transform the mundane into the miraculous, with nothing more than her presence and unconditional love. Luna knelt in the snow and carefully arranged the carnations at the base of the headstone, her small hands working with deliberate precision despite the cold. Then she pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper and placed it beside the flowers, weighing it down with a smooth river stone she'd been carrying in her pocket. "I told her about how you taught me to change the oil in the truck," she said conversationally as if Elena were sitting right there beside them in the snow. "And about Mrs. Henderson's cat that had 6 kittens. And about how you always make pancakes shaped like stars on Saturdays even when you're really tired." Marcus crouched beside his daughter, one hand resting gently on her shoulder as the wind tried to steal the warmth from their bodies. The storm was getting worse, but Luna seemed oblivious to the weather's urgency, lost in her one-sided conversation with the mother who lived now only in memory and love. "What else did you tell her?" he asked quietly, knowing that Luna's letters often contained wisdom that humbled him. "I told her that sometimes you cry in the shower when you think I can't hear," Luna said with devastating innocence, her words cutting through his defenses like a blade made of pure truth. "But that is okay, because crying means you loved someone very much, and love doesn't stop just because someone goes to heaven." The observation hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to close his eyes against the sudden sting of tears that had nothing to do with the bitter wind. How did she do that? How did his 9-year-old daughter consistently demonstrate wisdom that left him feeling like a student rather than a teacher? "You're right," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "That's exactly what it means." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, two small figures dwarfed by the vast Montana wilderness and the even vaster sky above. Marcus found himself thinking about the letter Luna had written about broken-winged butterflies and the possibility of healing. Elena had always believed that everything happened for a reason, that the universe had a way of placing people exactly where they needed to be when they needed to be there. It was a philosophy he'd struggled to maintain after losing her, especially during those dark months when the medical bills had piled up like accusations and the VA disability checks hadn't stretched far enough to cover both rent and groceries. He'd been forced to sell almost everything of value they'd owned, including Elena's engagement ring, a decision that still felt like betrayal, even though he'd used the money to pay for Luna's therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez. "Daddy?" Luna's voice cut through his brooding like sunlight through storm clouds. "I think we should go soon. The snow is getting angry and the angels are telling me that something important is about to happen." Her words sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. Luna's intuition was rarely wrong, and when she spoke about hearing things that others couldn't perceive, Marcus had learned to pay attention. Too many times her seemingly random observations had proven to be early warnings of change or danger. "Good call, little star," he said, standing and brushing snow from his knees. "Let's say goodbye to Mommy." Luna placed both small hands on the headstone and closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent conversation that Marcus didn't try to overhear. When she opened them again, her face was bright with the kind of peace that only children seemed capable of achieving. "I love you, Mommy," she said aloud. "Take care of the angels until we see you again." As they turned to leave, a sound cut through the wind that made Marcus's blood freeze in his veins. It was the distinctive whine of jet engines under stress, followed immediately by something that his military training recognized with crystal clarity, the sound of an aircraft in serious distress. He grabbed Luna's hand and pulled her against him, his eyes scanning the storm-darkened sky with the focused intensity of someone whose survival had once depended on identifying threats before they became fatal. For a moment there was nothing but swirling snow and howling wind. Then through a brief break in the clouds, he saw lights, aircraft navigation lights flying far too low and moving in a pattern that spoke of desperation rather than control. "What is it, Daddy?" Luna's voice was tight with concern, her supernatural sensitivity picking up on the tension radiating from him in waves. "Probably just a small plane trying to get ahead of the storm." He lied, though every instinct honed by years of combat was screaming that something was terribly wrong. The aircraft was losing altitude rapidly, and its erratic flight pattern suggested either catastrophic mechanical failure or something even worse. The sound of impact came from somewhere in the valley below. Not the explosive crash he'd been expecting, but the grinding, scraping noise of metal meeting earth at high speed followed by an ominous silence. Emergency landing. Someone had just put an aircraft down in the middle of a Montana blizzard, and they were almost certainly hurt, probably dying in the wreckage while the storm buried all evidence of their existence. Marcus's mind raced through calculations and possibilities. The smart thing, the responsible thing for a single father, would be to get Luna to the truck and drive to the nearest ranger station to report the crash. Let the professionals handle the rescue operations. He had responsibilities now, a daughter who depended on him for everything. Charging off into a blizzard to play hero wasn't exactly Father of the Year material. But then he thought about Elena, about her unwavering belief that people should help each other simply because it was the right thing to do. About the countless nights she'd worked extra shifts at the hospital because someone needed care, even when she was exhausted from her own cancer treatments. What would she do? The answer came immediately, accompanied by the sound of her voice in his memory. We help people, Marcus, that's what we do. We help people because everyone deserves someone in their corner when the world gets dark. Change of plans, sweetheart, he said, scooping Luna up and moving quickly toward the truck. We're going to help some people who might be hurt. Like fixing the butterfly, she asked as he buckled her into her seat with practiced efficiency. Just like fixing the butterfly. The road down from the cemetery was a winding ribbon of ice and treachery that demanded Marcus's complete attention under the best of circumstances. In a blizzard with visibility reduced to maybe 15 feet, and the wind trying to push his aging pickup into the guardrail every few seconds, it became an exercise in controlled terror. Luna sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes tracking the hypnotic dance of snowflakes in the headlight beams. She had inherited her mother's ability to remain calm in crisis situations, though Marcus suspected she didn't fully grasp the magnitude of danger they might be driving into. There, she said suddenly, pointing through the windshield, with the casual certainty of someone who saw things others missed. I see lights, but they feel wrong somehow. Marcus followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop like a stone. About half a mile ahead, just barely visible through the storm's fury, an orange glow flickered against the white landscape. Not the steady beam of aircraft navigation lights, but something much more ominous. The wavering dance of fire painting the snow in shades of amber and crimson. He pressed the accelerator carefully, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to rush toward the scene of destruction. A crash in these conditions would help no one, and Luna's safety had to take priority over everything else. The truck's ancient heater wheezed as it struggled to keep the windshield clear, and ice was already beginning to form at the edges of the glass like crystalline fingers reaching inward. As they drew closer, the scope of the situation became terrifyingly clear. A sleek private jet had made what could generously be called a controlled crash landing in a snow-covered meadow about 200 yards from the road. The aircraft had carved a long, violent furrow through the pristine snow before coming to rest against a cluster of towering pine trees, and small flames danced along its starboard wing, like demonic spirits celebrating destruction. But it was the other vehicles that made Marcus's blood run cold with recognition and dread. 3 black SUVs were positioned strategically around the crash site, their headlights creating a harsh perimeter of artificial daylight around the downed aircraft. Men in dark clothing moved between the vehicles with the purposeful efficiency of professionals, and even from a distance Marcus could see that several of them were carrying weapons that weren't standard law enforcement issue. This wasn't a rescue operation. This was something else entirely, something that set off every alarm bell his military training had installed in his psyche. Daddy. Luna's voice was smaller now, her supernatural sensitivity picking up on the malevolent energy that seemed to radiate from the scene below. Are those the helpers? I don't think so, sweetheart, he said quietly, pulling the truck to a stop behind a stand of trees that would hide them from the men below. His mind was shifting into tactical mode, weighing options with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments in places where the difference between friend and enemy was often measured in milliseconds. Someone had been on that plane when it went down. Someone who apparently had enemies willing to brave a Montana blizzard to find them. Which meant that whoever was down there was probably running for their life right now, alone in a snowstorm with armed pursuers closing in and nowhere to turn for help. Elena's voice echoed in his memory like a beacon cutting through the darkness. We help people, Marcus. That's what we do. We help people because everyone deserves someone in their corner when the world gets dark. Luna, I need you to listen very carefully, he he said, turning to face his daughter with the serious expression she'd learned to recognize as his life or death instructions face. I'm going to go help whoever was in that airplane. I need you to stay right here in the truck with the doors locked and the engine running. If anything scary happens, anything at all, I want you to drive to Mrs. Henderson's house and call 911. Do you remember how to drive? Luna nodded solemnly. He'd been teaching her basic vehicle operation since she turned 8, partly as a practical survival skill and partly because it made her feel grown up and responsible. She wasn't strong enough to work the pedals properly yet, but she could steer and shift if absolutely necessary. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, you leave without me. He continued, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. Promise me, Luna. Promise me you'll save yourself. I promise, she said, though her lower lip was beginning to tremble with suppressed emotion. But you're coming back, right? Mommy said you always come back. The absolute faith in her voice nearly shattered his resolve. She trusted him with the complete, unquestioning faith that only children possessed, the kind of faith that expected miracles and usually received them. That's right, little star, he said, reaching across to squeeze her small hand. I always come back. He reached under his seat and withdrew a compact pistol, a Glock 19 that he kept for emergencies and hoped he'd never need to use. It wasn't much against what appeared to be a professional military operation, but it was better than nothing. More importantly, he grabbed a tactical flashlight and a basic first aid kit from the glove compartment. 20 minutes, he reminded Luna, checking his watch and committing the time to memory. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Love you too, Daddy. Be careful and come home to me. Marcos slipped out of the truck and immediately felt the full fury of the storm hit him like a physical assault. The wind was strong enough to stagger him if he wasn't braced for it, and the snow was falling so hard that visibility beyond 8 feet was essentially zero. But the same conditions that made movement dangerous also provided excellent concealment. He moved through the trees with the careful stealth that had made him one of the Navy SEALs' most effective reconnaissance specialists. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to minimize noise and avoid detection, while maintaining his ability to observe and assess the tactical situation developing below. The men around the crash site were definitely professionals. Their positioning and coordination made that abundantly clear. But they were also dealing with the same blizzard conditions that limited his own capabilities, which might give him the only advantage he was likely to get. As he drew closer to the wreckage, fragments of conversation began to reach him through the howling wind. No sign of her in the fuselage. Tracks leading north toward the tree line? Can't have gotten far in this weather, not injured. Her, so the person they were hunting was a woman and she'd survived the crash and escaped into the forest. Marcus felt a flicker of professional admiration for whoever she was. Walking away from a plane crash took serious luck. Doing it in a Montana blizzard while being hunted by armed men required extraordinary courage and will to survive. He needed to find her before they did. Moving parallel to the search teams, Marcus began working his way toward the northern tree line where the tracks had been spotted. The snow was coming down so heavily now that any footprints would be filling in rapidly, but there were other signs for someone who knew how to read them. Broken branches hanging at unnatural angles, disturbed snow patterns that spoke of desperate passage, the subtle disturbances that marked the path of someone moving in panic rather than stealth. The forest grew denser as he moved away from the crash site, pine trees looming out of the darkness like ancient guardians protecting secrets too dark for daylight. The storm's fury was somewhat muted by the canopy, but the cold was becoming genuinely dangerous. Whoever he was tracking wouldn't survive long in these conditions without proper gear and shelter. A sound reached him through the wind, the sharp crack of a breaking branch somewhere ahead and to his left. Too sudden and distinct to be natural, especially in air so still it felt solid. Someone was moving through the underbrush and they weren't being particularly careful about stealth versus speed. Marcos increased his pace while maintaining his own careful movement, following the sound while staying alert for any sign that the pursuit teams had picked up the same trail. Behind him, he could hear voices growing more distant as the searchers spread out in an expanding pattern, their coordination hampered by the storm and the vast area they needed to cover. Another sound reached him, a muffled cry of pain or frustration quickly cut off, as if the person making it had caught themselves before revealing their position. Close now, very close. He rounded a massive pine tree whose trunk was wide enough to hide a small building and nearly stumbled over her. She was huddled at the base of the enormous tree pressed against the bark, as if she could somehow merge with it and disappear entirely from the world. Blood ran from a gash on her forehead, dark against pale skin made almost luminescent by the cold, and her expensive-looking coat was torn in several places that spoke of violent contact with unforgiving surfaces. But it was her eyes that struck him first, alert, intelligent, and absolutely furious, despite the obvious pain and hypothermia. When she saw him emerge from the storm like some ghost made of snow and shadow, her hand moved immediately to something at her waist. In the dim light, Marcus caught the glint of metal and recognized the distinctive profile of a compact pistol. Smart woman, armed, aware, and definitely not planning to go quietly into whatever night her pursuers had planned for her. "Stay back," she said, her voice steady despite the violent chattering of her teeth. "I don't know who sent you, but I'm not going anywhere without a fight." Wah. The accent was American, but refined East Coast money, the kind of careful diction that came with expensive schools and unlimited opportunities. Her clothing, what he could see of it beneath the tears and bloodstains, spoke of serious wealth. High-quality materials tailored, fit the kind of attention to detail that came with resources most people could barely imagine. But money hadn't kept her out of this mess, and it wasn't going to get her out of it either. "Easy," Marcus said quietly, raising his hands to show they were empty while keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "I'm not with them. I saw the crash from up on the ridge and came down to help." Her eyes narrowed, studying his face in the dim light filtering through the snow-laden branches above them. Trust was a luxury that could get you killed, and she was clearly someone who understood that principle on a visceral level. "Prove it," she said, and there was steel in her voice despite her obvious vulnerability. It was a reasonable request under the circumstances. In her position, he'd be just as suspicious of anyone who appeared out of a blizzard claiming to be a good Samaritan. But time was working against them both. The cold was becoming genuinely life-threatening, and the search teams would eventually work their way in this direction using simple grid patterns. "My name is Marcus Steele," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm a mechanic from town. I was visiting my wife's grave with my daughter when your plane came down. Those men around your crash site aren't rescue workers, they're hunting you. And if we don't move soon, they're going to find you." Something in his tone must have convinced her because she lowered the pistol fractionally while maintaining her grip on it. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Instead of answering directly, Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. The wallpaper was a photo of him and Luna at last summer's county fair, both of them grinning at the camera while sharing a stick of cotton candy larger than the child's head. It was the kind of picture that couldn't be faked, the kind of genuine moment that spoke to character in ways that words never could. "That's Luna," he said simply. "She's 9 years old. Right now she's sitting in my truck about a quarter mile from here, waiting for me to come back with whoever was in that plane. I promised her I'd help because that's what her mother would have wanted me to do." The woman studied the photo for a long moment, her eyes moving between the image and his face as if searching for deception or inconsistency. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she tucked the pistol back inside her coat with obvious reluctance. "Victoria," she said quietly. "Victoria Sterling." Even through the storm and adrenaline, the name registered like a bell tolling in the distance. Marcus didn't follow business news particularly closely. His world was bounded by carburetors and transmission fluid and keeping Luna fed and clothed, but Sterling Technologies was hard to miss. Defense contracts, cutting-edge technology, billions in government funding, flowing through projects that existed mostly in classified reports and congressional oversight hearings. This woman wasn't just wealthy, she was one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, someone whose decisions affected global markets and international security policies, which explained why professional killers were chasing her through a Montana blizzard on Christmas Eve. "Can you walk?" he asked, already assessing her injuries and calculating the best route back to his truck. The head wound looked painful but probably not life-threatening, and she was favoring her left side in a way that suggested bruised or cracked ribs rather than anything more serious. "I can do whatever I have to do," Victoria said, struggling to her feet with obvious determination masked by iron will. "But I need to warn you, these people aren't going to stop hunting me just because the weather's bad. If they see you helping me, you'll become a target too. Your daughter will become a target." The warning sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. He thought of Luna sitting alone in the truck, trusting him to come back, counting on him to keep the promises that were all she had left of stability in a world that had already taken her mother. Getting involved in whatever Victoria Sterling was running from could put his daughter in danger. But leaving her here to die in the snow wasn't an option either, not when he had the power to help, not when Elena's voice was echoing in his memory with crystal clarity. "Then we'll just have to make sure they don't see us," he said. They began moving through the forest with agonizing care, Marcus leading and Victoria following close behind. Every few steps he would pause to listen for sounds of pursuit, but the storm was providing excellent acoustic cover. The wind howled through the trees with enough violence to mask their movement, and the snow was falling so heavily that their tracks were already beginning to fill in behind them. Victoria proved to be tougher than her injuries suggested. She kept pace without complaint, moving with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to pushing through discomfort and pain. When she stumbled on a hidden root, she caught herself without making a sound. When branches caught at her torn coat, she extracted herself with methodical patience that spoke to serious mental discipline. "You're military," she observed quietly during one of their brief rest stops. It wasn't a question. "Formers," Marcus replied, scanning the trees around them for any sign of movement. "Navy SEALs. Got out 3 years ago." "Discharged or resigned?" The question was more pointed than casual conversation warranted, and it suggested that Victoria Sterling knew more about military culture than most corporate executives. "What makes you think there's a difference?" "Because I know what it looks like when someone leaves the service voluntarily versus when they're forced out by circumstances beyond their control." Victoria said, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "And you move like someone who's had advanced training but lost faith in the system that provided it." She was perceptive in ways that made Marcus wonder what exactly Victoria Sterling's company did beyond the public face of defense technology research. But this wasn't the time or place for detailed background discussions. "We can compare notes later," he said. "Right now let's focus on staying alive long enough to have a later." So, they reached the edge of the forest without incident, but the final approach to Marcus's truck would require crossing about 50 yards of open ground. The storm provided some concealment, but it wouldn't be enough if any of the search teams happened to be looking in the right direction at the wrong moment. Through the swirling snow, Marcus could see his pickup right where he'd left it, exhaust still visible from the tailpipe as Luna kept the engine running. She would be getting worried by now. They'd been gone for nearly 18 minutes, close to the deadline he'd established. But he could also see lights moving in the distance as the hunters continued their systematic search of the surrounding area. "When I say run, we go straight for the truck," he told Victoria, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Don't look back, don't hesitate. Don't think about anything except reaching that door. My daughter is going to unlock the passenger side when she sees us coming. Get in the back seat and stay low until I tell you otherwise." Victoria nodded, her jaw set with the kind of determination that had probably built her business empire. Blood was still seeping from the cut on her forehead, and Marcus could see exhaustion beginning to take its toll, despite her obvious strength and conditioning. They needed to get her somewhere warm soon, or hypothermia would finish what the plane crash had started. He counted down silently, watching the pattern of the distant lights, waiting for the right moment, when all the searchers would be looking in other directions and focused on different sections of their grid pattern. Now! They ran across the open ground like their lives depended on it, because their lives absolutely depended on it. The snow grabbed at their feet with every step, and the wind tried to knock them sideways into obstacles they couldn't see. Marcus kept one hand on Victoria's arm, helping her maintain her balance as they struggled across the uneven terrain toward the promise of safety and warmth. Behind them, he could hear shouting they'd been spotted by someone with exceptional night vision, or just extraordinary bad timing. But the truck was close now, close enough that he could see Luna's anxious face in the passenger window, her eyes wide with concern and relief. The passenger door flew open as they approached, revealing Luna's small form silhouetted against the dome light. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice carrying all the fear and love and desperate hope that had been building during his absence. "Down!" Marcus commanded, and Luna immediately dropped below the window level as he'd taught her during their emergency drills. Victoria dove into the back seat with practiced efficiency, and Marcus threw himself behind the wheel, gunning the engine before his door was fully closed. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning for a heart-stopping moment before finding traction on the icy road surface. In the rearview mirror, Marcus could see lights converging on their former position, but the storm and darkness provided enough cover that immediate pursuit would be difficult if not impossible. Everyone okay? He asked, checking on his passengers as he navigated the treacherous mountain road with all the skill 20 years of Montana winters had taught him. I'm fine, Daddy, Luna said from her position on the floor, her voice slightly muffled but strong. Is the hurt lady okay? From the back seat came a weak laugh that carried surprising warmth despite the circumstances. The hurt lady is going to be fine thanks to your very brave father. Marcos glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Victoria attempting to staunch the bleeding from her head wound with what appeared to be a silk scarf. She looked pale and shaky, but her eyes were alert and focused. More importantly, she was talking to Luna with the gentle tone of someone comfortable around children. What's your name? Luna asked with the directness that only 9-year-olds could manage without seeming rude. Victoria, what's yours? Luna, like the moon. Daddy says I'm named after something beautiful that watches over people in the dark. He's absolutely right, Victoria said with genuine warmth. Luna is one of the most beautiful names I've ever heard. It means you're a guardian, someone who brings light to dark places. Despite everything, the crash, the chase, the armed men in the forest, Marcus felt a small smile tug at his lips. Trust his daughter to find the human connection in any situation, no matter how dangerous or chaotic. It was perhaps Elena's greatest gift to their child, the ability to see people rather than circumstances to find the common ground that linked all hearts together. But they weren't safe yet. The men pursuing Victoria were clearly professionals with serious backing and unlimited resources. Simply getting away from the immediate area wasn't enough. They needed somewhere secure to regroup and figure out their next move before the hunters could reorganize and continue their pursuit. There's a ranger station about 10 miles down the mountain, he said, thinking tactically about their options. We can... No. Victoria's voice cut through his planning with sharp urgency that left no room for argument. No police, no officials, no one in any kind of government position. These people have resources you can't imagine. They'll have infiltrated local law enforcement within hours of hitting the ground. Marcus frowned, his mind automatically shifting to assess this new information. He'd been thinking like a civilian, get to safety, contact authorities, let someone else handle the bigger picture. But Victoria was suggesting something much more complex and dangerous. Then where? He asked. I don't know. She admitted with the kind of honesty that suggested she was used to having answers and didn't like being without them. Somewhere remote. Somewhere we can disappear while I figure out who's behind this and how to stop them permanently. From her position on the floor of the cab, Luna's small voice piped up with the innocent wisdom that had guided them through so many challenges. We could go to the cabin. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat like a physical obstruction. The cabin. He hadn't been there since Elena died, couldn't bear the memories it contained of plans and dreams that would never come to fruition. But it was isolated, defensible, and completely off any official records. What cabin, sweetheart? Victoria asked gently, her tone suggesting she understood this might be important. Daddy and Mommy built a secret cabin in the mountains for when they wanted to be alone together. Luna explained with the matter-of-fact tone she used for discussing miracles. It's got food and blankets and everything we need to hide from bad people. Daddy taught me how to get there in case of emergencies. In the rearview mirror, Marcos saw Victoria's eyes meet his with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what Luna was offering, a safe house that wouldn't appear on any database, someplace completely disconnected from the digital networks that professional hunters would use to track their movements. It's about 2 hours from here in good weather, he said quietly, his voice rougher than he'd intended. But the road is rough, and in this storm... It's better than being caught, Victoria replied without hesitation. And I think we're going to need time to figure out exactly what we're dealing with before we can plan our next move. Marcus nodded and adjusted their route, heading deeper into the mountains instead of down toward the relative safety of civilization. Behind them, the lights of their pursuers disappeared into the storm, but he knew the reprieve was only temporary. Victoria Sterling was clearly running from something much bigger than a simple business dispute, and whatever it was, it had followed her into his life and threatened his daughter's future. The smart thing would be to drop her at the next town and disappear with Luna, start over, somewhere these people would never think to look for a mechanic and his 9-year-old daughter. But as he glanced again at the woman in his back seat, injured, hunted but still trying to protect strangers from the danger she'd brought into their lives, Marcus found himself thinking of broken-winged butterflies and the possibility of flight after falling. Elena would have told him to stay and help, And despite the fear gnawing at his gut, despite the very real danger to everything he held dear, he knew that's exactly what he was going to do. The truck climbed higher into the mountains carrying three unlikely allies toward a reckoning with secrets that would change all their lives forever. Behind them, the storm erased their tracks like a benediction, while ahead lay the uncertain promise of a place where healing might be possible if they could survive long enough to find it. In the passenger seat, Luna hummed softly to herself, a melody her mother had taught her about brave hearts and second chances. And in that simple song, carried on the voice of a child who still believed in happy endings, lay the seed of hope that would sustain them through the darkness ahead. The cabin emerged from the darkness like something from a forgotten dream, its snow-covered roof and warm yellow windows promising shelter from the storm that had been battering them for the past 2 hours. Marcus's hands ached from gripping the steering wheel as he navigated the final stretch of barely visible road, but seeing their destination brought a wave of relief so intense it was almost painful. "There it is," Luna whispered from the passenger seat, her voice filled with wonder despite her exhaustion. "It looks just like I remembered." In the back seat, Victoria stirred from the exhausted half-sleep she'd fallen into during the difficult journey. The bleeding from her head wound had stopped, but Marcus could see the strain of the evening's events written across her features in lines of pain and fatigue. She needed medical attention, food, and warmth in that order. "How long since you've been here?" Victoria asked, studying the cabin through the windshield with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to assessing tactical situations. 3 years. Marcus replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken grief. "Since Elena died." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with the kind of loss that marked people permanently. This place had been their sanctuary, his and Elena's, a retreat from the world where they could simply exist together without the weight of his PTSD or her cancer treatments. They'd built it themselves over the course of 2 summers, every boredom being placed with love and hope for a future that had been cut tragically short. Now he was bringing strangers into that sacred space, and he wasn't sure how he felt about it. The truck's headlights swept across the cabin's front porch as Marcus maneuvered into the small clearing that served as a parking area. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it, the woodpile covered by a weathered tarp, the rocking chairs Elena had insisted on despite his protest that they were too domestic, the wind chimes that played soft melodies whenever the mountain breezes stirred them. "It's beautiful," Victoria said softly, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood the significance of what she was seeing. "Mommy loved it here," Luna said with the matter-of-fact acceptance that characterized most of her observations about her deceased mother. She said it was where the angels came to rest when they got tired of flying. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always came when Luna shared one of Elena's sayings. His wife had possessed an almost mystical ability to find magic in the simplest moments, to transform ordinary experiences into something transcendent through the sheer force of her optimism and love. "She sounds like she was very wise," Victoria replied, her voice gentle with the kind of respect that suggested genuine understanding rather than polite sympathy. "She was." Marcus agreed, then forced himself to focus on the practical needs of the moment. "Let's get inside and warm up. Then we can figure out what comes next." The cabin's interior was exactly as he'd left it, though covered with 3 years' worth of dust and the particular stillness that comes with long abandonment. The main room featured a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, flanked by built-in bookshelves that Elena had filled with everything from poetry to philosophy to her beloved romance novels. A small kitchen occupied one corner, and a ladder led to a sleeping loft that had been Luna's favorite hiding place during their visits. "There's a generator out back," Marcus said, moving immediately toward the fireplace while Luna showed Victoria where Elena had kept her emergency supplies. "I'll get it running once we have some heat going." Elena was military too, Army medic. She understood the value of being prepared. He opened the flue and began building a fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed this ritual hundreds of times. The kindling caught quickly, and soon flames were crackling cheerfully in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's walls and filling the space with welcome warmth. "There's a first aid kit in that cabinet," Luna said, pointing Victoria toward a collection of medical supplies that would have equipped a small field hospital. "Mommy made sure we always had everything we might need to help hurt people." While they sorted through the first aid supplies, Marcus focused on getting the generator running. The machine coughed to life on the third pull, filling the cabin with electric light and the comforting hum of modern technology. Soon the space felt less like an abandoned shrine and more like the welcoming refuge Elena had intended it to be. This should help with the bleeding. Victoria's voice drew his attention back to the present. She was holding a small bottle of antiseptic while Luna carefully unwrapped a sterile bandage, her small hands moving with the competent precision of someone who'd been trained in basic medical care. "I can do that," Marcos said, moving toward them with the intention of taking over the medical duties. "I can manage." Victoria replied, though he could see her hands trembling slightly from cold and shock. "I've had some experience with field medicine." There was something in the way she said it that suggested her experience went beyond the basics most corporate executives might know, but Marcos didn't press. Everyone had secrets, and Victoria Sterling clearly had more than most. The important thing was getting her patched up and figuring out their next move. "At least let me help," he insisted, gently kneeling beside her chair. "You can't see the full extent of the wound." After a moment's hesitation, Victoria nodded and allowed him to begin carefully cleaning the gash on her forehead. The wound was deeper than he'd initially thought, but not life-threatening. She'd been lucky a few inches lower and she might have lost an eye. "This is going to sting," he warned before applying the antiseptic. Victoria gritted her teeth but didn't make a sound as the liquid bit into the open wound. Her stoicism impressed him. Most people would have at least hissed in pain, but she bore the discomfort with the kind of controlled endurance that spoke to serious mental discipline. "You're tougher than you look," he observed quietly as he applied the bandage. "I have to be," she replied, her voice carrying undertones of experiences she wasn't ready to share. "In my line of work, showing weakness is an invitation for people to try to destroy you." Luna, who had been watching the medical procedure with fascination, tilted her head thoughtfully. "What kind of work do you do that makes people want to hurt you?" It was an innocent question, but it cut straight to the heart of their situation. Victoria met the child's curious gaze for a long moment before answering with careful honesty. "I run a company that makes things to keep people safe," she said slowly. "But sometimes the bad people don't like that because it makes their jobs harder." "Like superheroes?" Luna asked, her eyes lighting up with interest. "Something like that." Victoria agreed with a small smile that transformed her features from corporate severity to genuine warmth. Marcus finished applying the bandage and sat back on his heels. "There, that should hold until we can get you to a real doctor." "Thank you," Victoria said, and he could hear genuine gratitude in her voice. "I know this isn't what you signed up for when you decided to help a stranger." Before he could respond, the sound reached them that made his blood run cold. The distant rumble of engines moving slowly up the mountain road they just traveled. Multiple vehicles moving with the careful precision of people who weren't entirely sure of their destination but were determined to find it. "They found us." Victoria breathed, her face going pale beneath the fresh bandage. Marcos moved immediately to the cabin's front window and peered through the curtains. Through the swirling snow, he could see lights moving among the trees, at least 3 vehicles, maybe more. The hunters had somehow tracked them despite the storm and the remote location. "How?" he muttered, his mind racing through possibilities up there. "There's no way they could have followed us in this weather." Victoria's expression grew grim with understanding. "GPS tracker. They must have planted one on your truck while we were hiding in the forest." The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. In his focus on getting Victoria to safety, he'd led these killers straight to the most sacred place he knew. Elena's sanctuary was about to become a battleground, and it was his fault. "Daddy," Luna's small voice was tight with fear as she picked up on the tension filling the room. "Are the bad people coming here?" "It's going to be okay, little star," he said automatically, though his mind was already shifting into tactical mode. "We're going to play that game we practiced, remember? The one where you have to be very quiet and very brave." They had practiced emergency procedures in the months after Elena's death, when his PTSD was at its worst, and he'd been plagued by paranoid fears about threats to his daughter. He taught Luna where to hide, how to stay silent, what to do if dangerous people ever came looking for them. He'd hoped they'd never need those skills. "The special hiding place?" Luna asked quietly, her voice remarkably steady for a 9-year-old facing mortal danger. "That's right. Can you show Victoria where it is?" Luna nodded and took Victoria's hand, leading her toward a section of the cabin's back wall that looked identical to every other section. But Marcos and Elena had built a hidden panel there, concealed behind a bookshelf that swung out on hidden hinges to reveal a small storage space originally intended for emergency supplies. "It's not very big," Luna explained to Victoria as they opened the hiding spot. "But it's safe. Daddy made it so the bad people could never find me." Victoria stared at the hidden compartment for a moment, then looked back at Marcos with something like awe in her eyes. "You built a panic room." "I built a father's peace of mind," he corrected grimly, then moved toward the closet where Elena had kept her own emergency preparations. The sound of engines was getting closer now, and Marcos could hear voices carrying on the wind. Professional voices, calm and coordinated. These weren't random criminals or desperate amateurs. They were experienced operatives with serious backing and unlimited resources. "How many men do you think?" Victoria asked, moving toward the window to get her own assessment of the situation. "At least 6, probably more." Marcos replied, his military training automatically cataloging threats and calculating odds. "They'll establish a perimeter first, then move in systematically. We have maybe 5 minutes before they're in position." He opened the closet and felt a surge of gratitude for his wife's foresight. Along with medical supplies and emergency rations, Elena had maintained a small arsenal, a hunting rifle, a shotgun, and several boxes of ammunition. Not enough to fight off a professional assault team indefinitely, but sufficient to make them think twice about rushing in. "What kind of weapons do we have?" Victoria asked, examining the cache with the professional interest of someone who understood tactical situations. The question was asked with the casual competence of someone accustomed to planning defensive operations, and Marcus found himself once again reassessing his understanding of Victoria Sterling. CEOs didn't usually think in terms of weapons counts and defensive positions. "Enough to hold them off temporarily, Paul," he said, shouldering the rifle and checking its action, "but not enough for a prolonged engagement." As if summoned by his words, a new sound reached them through the storm, the distinctive crack of a branch breaking under a careful footstep. "Close, very close." "They're moving into position," Marcus whispered, moving toward the hidden compartment where Luna was waiting. "Time to go." But as they turned toward the hiding place, Victoria suddenly grabbed his arm with urgent intensity.
"Wait, Islam,"
she said, her voice carrying a weight that suggested whatever she was about to reveal would change everything. "There's something you need to know before this goes any further." "Not now," Marcus hissed, acutely aware that armed men were surrounding his sanctuary. "Whatever secrets you're carrying can wait until we're all still breathing." "No, they can't," Victoria insisted with desperate urgency. "Because what I'm about to tell you changes everything about why these people are here and what they're willing to do to get me." The sound of footsteps was getting closer, and Marcus could now see shadows moving past the windows. They were out of time for lengthy explanations, but something in Victoria's expression told him this wasn't just pre-battle nerves. "Then tell me fast," he said grimly. Victoria took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her words shattered his understanding of everything that had happened that night. "My real name isn't Victoria Sterling," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a confession 3 years in the making. "It's Natasha Volkov, and 12 years ago your unit was sent to assassinate my father." The words hit Marcos like a physical blow, sending his mind reeling backward through time to a mission he'd spent years trying to forget. 12 years ago, the classified operation in Montenegro, the arms dealer they'd been sent to eliminate a Russian named Viktor Volkov, who'd been selling advanced weapons technology to terrorist organizations around the world. The mission that had ended his faith in the system he'd sworn to serve. "That's impossible," he whispered, though even as he spoke the denial, pieces were clicking into place with terrible clarity. "Viktor Volkov died in that warehouse. We confirmed the kill." "No," Victoria Natasha said quietly, her eyes holding a pain that spoke to years of carefully buried grief. "You didn't, because you refused to pull the trigger when you realized he had a daughter hiding in the building. You aborted the mission and called for extraction." The memory came flooding back with devastating clarity. He'd been positioned on a rooftop overlooking the warehouse rifle scope, trained on Viktor Volkov, as the man conducted a weapons demonstration for potential buyers. A clean-shot textbook assassination protocol. Until a child had run into his line of sight, a girl maybe 10 years old calling out for her papa in accented English that mixed fear and love in equal measure. Marcus had frozen. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 years he'd stared through that scope at a father and daughter, and he'd been unable to reconcile his mission parameters with his fundamental humanity. In the end, he'd radioed his team leader and reported that civilian casualties were unacceptable mission parameters, had changed immediate extraction required. It had been the beginning of the end of his military career. The follow-up team completed the mission 3 days later, he said hollowly, his voice barely audible over the approaching footsteps outside. Intelligence confirmed Viktor Volkov was dead. Intelligence was wrong, Natasha replied, her voice thick with emotions she'd kept buried for over a decade. My father survived the initial assassination attempt, but he was badly wounded. He lived long enough to arrange for my safety, but he died 6 months later from complications related to his injuries. Around them, the sounds of their hunters moving into position grew more pronounced, but Marcus found himself frozen by the implications of what he was hearing. The adoption, if Victoria Sterling, was my father's final contingency plan, Natasha confirmed. Richard Sterling was one of his legitimate business partners, a defense contractor who'd been secretly buying technology for years. When my father died, Sterling adopted me, gave me a new identity, and eventually turned Sterling Technologies into exactly what my father had always dreamed of, a legitimate company with government contracts and unlimited access to classified research. The tactical part of Marcus's mind was screaming at him to move to get his daughter to safety and worry about the implications of these revelations later. But the human part, the part that had carried guilt over that mission for 12 years, needed to understand the full scope of what he was facing. Then why are they hunting you? He asked, his voice rough with confusion and dawning comprehension. If you've been operating legitimately... Because 3 months ago I discovered that Sterling Technologies wasn't as legitimate as I'd thought, Natasha said bitterly, her words carrying the weight of betrayal and shattered illusions. Richard Sterling had been using our government contracts to sell technology to the same kind of people my father once served. When I tried to stop him, I learned that he wasn't acting alone. The syndicate, Marcus breathed, remembering fragments of intelligence briefings from his final months in the service. They called themselves that, yes, Natasha confirmed. And when I threatened to expose them, they decided I'd become too dangerous to live. The plane crash wasn't an accident, it was sabotage. Those men hunting us aren't freelance killers. They're part of a network that reaches into the highest levels of government and corporate power. A shadow passed by the front window, and Marcus saw the distinctive silhouette of an assault rifle. They were completely out of time for explanations, no matter how earth-shattering they might be. We finish this conversation later, he said grimly, moving toward the hidden compartment where Luna waited with wide, frightened eyes. Right now, we focus on staying alive. But as they reached the concealed panel, Luna looked up at them with the uncanny perception that had always marked her as special. The lady isn't who she said she was, is she, Daddy? She asked quietly, her supernatural sensitivity picking up on the emotional turbulence that filled the cabin like a visible presence. Natasha knelt beside the child, her expression soft despite the danger closing in around them. No, sweetheart, I'm sorry I had to lie. Sometimes grown-ups have to pretend to be someone else to stay safe. Like when you told me we were going to visit Grandma that one time, but we really went to the doctor for my shots, Luna asked Marcus with devastating directness. Exactly like that. He confirmed, his heart breaking at his daughter's ability to find simple parallels for complex adult deceptions. Sometimes lies are about protection, not about hurting people. Luna nodded solemnly, then surprised them both by reaching out to take Natasha's hand in both of her small ones. It's okay, I still like you even if your name is different. Names don't change what's in people's hearts. The simple acceptance in his daughter's voice made Marcus's chest tight with emotion. Children, he reflected, were often wiser than adults when it came to judging character. Luna had instinctively recognized something trustworthy in this woman, regardless of the deception surrounding her identity. Into the hiding place now, he instructed gently but firmly. Both of you. And no matter what you hear, you don't come out until I come get you personally. What if you can't come get us? Luna asked with the kind of devastating directness that only children possessed. The question he'd hoped she'd never ask. The scenario he'd prepared for but prayed would never come to pass. Then you count to 1,000 very slowly, He said the words feeling like broken glass in his throat. "And then you take Natasha and you go out the back way we practiced. You go to Mrs. Henderson's house and call 911. But what about you?" "I'll be fine, little star. I always am, remember. It was a lie and they both knew it. But it was the kind of lie that love required, the kind of protective fiction that allowed children to maintain hope, despite the monsters that stalked the edges of their world." Luna nodded with solemn understanding and crawled into the hidden compartment, followed by Natasha. Before closing the panel, the woman caught Marcus's eye with an expression that held years of regret and gratitude. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice barely audible, "for bringing this to your door, for putting your daughter at risk, for all the things my family's choices cost you." "We'll settle accounts later," he replied grimly. "If there is a later." He closed the panel just as the cabin's front window exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Professional assault teams didn't knock. They announced their arrival with flashbang grenades and overwhelming firepower, designed to disorient and demoralize their targets before they could mount any effective resistance. But Marcus was already moving, rolling away from the window, as the first shot splintered the air where he'd been standing moments before. Military training kicked in like muscle memory activated by mortal danger, and suddenly he wasn't a small-town mechanic anymore. He was Petty Officer First Class Marcus Steele, Navy SEAL, and these bastards had just made the fatal mistake of threatening his daughter. They were about to learn why that was a very bad idea. The first tactical error his attackers made was assuming they were dealing with a civilian. The second was underestimating what a father would do to protect his child when backed into a corner with no other options. Marcus moved through the cabin with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of close-quarters combat. Every piece of furniture became cover, every shadow a potential advantage. Elena's carefully arranged living space transformed into a three-dimensional chessboard where positioning meant the difference between life and death. The assault team entered through multiple points simultaneously, front door, back door, and the shattered window. Professional coordination, but they were operating in an unfamiliar environment while he knew every inch of this space intimately. That gave him the only edge he was likely to get against superior numbers and firepower. The first man through the front door never saw the hunting rifle's muzzle flash that dropped him. The second got 3 steps into the room before Marcus's follow-up shot sent him diving for cover behind Elena's favorite reading chair. "Target has military training," a voice called out through the chaos, the words carrying the sharp edge of professionals who just realized their intelligence briefing had been inadequate. "Repeat, target is trained military. Adjust tactics accordingly." Too little too late. They'd come expecting to intimidate a mechanic, not fight a Navy SEAL on his home ground. But Marcus's advantages were temporary. At best he was outnumbered at least 4-1, and they had superior equipment and body armor that his hunting rifles couldn't penetrate effectively. He needed to even the odds before they could reorganize and overwhelm him through sheer numbers and firepower. Moving low and fast, he worked his way toward the kitchen area where Elena had installed a propane connection for the camping stove she'd loved to use during their romantic getaways. A few quick shots into the gas line filled the air with the distinctive smell of escaping fuel. Not enough for an immediate explosion, but enough to create a serious hazard if he could find the right ignition source. "Movement in the kitchen," someone reported with professional calm. "Team 2 moved to flank." Marcus smiled grimly as he heard footsteps approaching his position. "Let them come." The kitchen was designed to look like a dead end, which they probably thought had trapped him. What they didn't know was that Elena had insisted on a service door that led to the back porch, a second exit she'd planned to use for bringing in groceries and supplies. He slipped through that door just as 2 assault team members rounded the corner into the kitchen, their tactical lights cutting through the cabin's interior like white-hot spears. They were focused on clearing the space where they expected him to be, not watching their rear approaches for counterattack. The shotgun blast took them both down before they could react or call out a warning to their teammates. But the victory came at a cost Marcus couldn't afford. He could hear more voices outside, backup teams moving into position, probably with heavier weapons and better intel about the cabin's layout. Soon they'd have the building completely surrounded, and his options would dwindle to zero. That's when the sound reached him that made his blood freeze in absolute terror. Luna's muffled cry of fear from somewhere behind the cabin's back wall. They'd found the hiding place. Every tactical consideration vanished in an instant, replaced by the pure primal fury of a father whose child was in mortal danger. Marcos burst back into the cabin, moving with such focused violence that the remaining assault team members actually fell back in shock at the intensity of his assault. He found them clustered around the hidden panel, which had been torn open to reveal the small compartment where his daughter and Natasha huddled together in terror. One of the men was reaching in to pull them out, while another held a pistol trained on the opening, his finger already tightening on the trigger. "Don't move," the gunman called out as Marcos appeared in the doorway. "Drop your weapons or the kid dies." Time seemed to slow as Marcos assessed the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. Two men, both armed and professional. His daughter visible in the compartment, tears streaming down her face, but trying desperately to be brave. Natasha shielding Luna with her own body, her eyes meeting his with an expression that clearly communicated she'd die before she let anyone hurt the child. In that moment of absolute clarity, Marcos made a choice that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. He was going to trust the woman who'd brought death to his door. "Natasha," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the gunmen. "When I move, you take Luna and run. Don't look back, don't hesitate. Get her to safety." "Marcos, no." Natasha started to protest, understanding what he was planning. "That's an order," he said with the voice he'd once used to command men in combat situations where hesitation meant death. "Protect my daughter." The gunman's finger was tightening on the trigger when Marcos moved not toward them as they expected, but sideways, drawing their fire away from the compartment while simultaneously triggering the improvised explosive device he'd been planning since entering the kitchen. The cabin's propane line ignited with a roar that shook the entire structure. The explosion wasn't large enough to bring down the building, but it was sufficient to create chaos, confusion, and most importantly, the distraction he needed to give Luna and Natasha a chance to escape. In the seconds of shock and disorientation that followed, while his attackers dealt with flying debris and the sudden wash of heat and light, Marcos heard the sounds he'd been praying for: Natasha's voice urgently directing Luna toward the back exit, followed by the slam of the service door and the crunch of footsteps in snow. They were out, his daughter was safe, which meant he could stop holding back and fight with everything he had. The next few minutes dissolved into a blur of violence that would have been impossible to follow for anyone not trained in the brutal mathematics of close-quarters combat. Marcos moved through the smoke and chaos like a ghost made of deadly purpose, using every technique learned through years of special operations training to turn Elena's peaceful sanctuary into a killing ground. When the smoke finally cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded into the Montana night, 5 professional killers lay dead among the wreckage of what had once been his refuge with Elena. The cabin was destroyed, its walls scarred by bullet holes and its interior gutted by fire, but Marcos was still breathing. There was no time to mourn the destruction of his sacred place. Through the settling dust and smoke, he could hear engines starting outside. Surviving members of the assault team were falling back to regroup. They'd return with reinforcements and heavier weapons probably within the hour. He needed to find Luna and Natasha and get them far away from here before the hunters could reorganize their pursuit. Marcos grabbed what weapons and ammunition he could salvage from the wreckage and slipped out through the service door into the howling storm. The wind had picked up even more during the firefight, creating near whiteout conditions that would make tracking difficult for both hunter and hunted. He followed the footprints leading away from the cabin toward the tree line, his heart hammering with the desperate need to find his daughter alive and unharmed. The tracks were already beginning to fill in with fresh snow, but he could still make out the distinctive pattern of Luna's small boots alongside the deeper impressions left by Natasha's expensive shoes. He found them huddled together beside a massive fallen log about 300 yards into the forest, Luna wrapped in Natasha's coat while both of them shivered violently from cold and shock. When they saw him emerging from the storm, Luna's face lit up with relief so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. "Daddy!" she cried, launching herself into his arms with the kind of desperate joy that spoke to how terrified she'd been. "I'm here, little star," he said, gathering her against his chest and feeling the terrible tension in his body begin to ease. "I'm here. You're safe." "The bad men?" Natasha asked quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly how close they'd all come to dying. "Won't be bothering anyone else," Marcos replied grimly, his words carrying implications that Natasha was smart enough not to ask him to clarify. "And their friends, Gil. Regrouping, we have maybe 30 minutes before they come back with everything they've got." Natasha nodded, her expression thoughtful despite their desperate situation. Then we need to disappear completely. They'll keep coming until they find me, and now they know you're involved. Your daughter will never be safe as long as I'm with you. No, Luna said, firmly, surprising both adults with the strength in her small voice. We don't leave friends behind. That's what Mommy always said. Friends stick together when things get scary. From the mouths of babes. Marcus found himself thinking of Elena's unwavering belief in helping others, in standing by people who needed support, even when it was dangerous or inconvenient. His wife would never have forgiven him for abandoning Natasha to face this nightmare alone. Luna's right, he said quietly, his decision made. We stick together, but we need to get moving, and we need a plan that goes beyond just running until they catch us. I might have an idea about that, Natasha said slowly, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone about to propose something dangerous. But you're not going to like it. Try me. There's a facility about 50 miles north of here. Sterling Technologies Black Site Research Installation. Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's where we develop our most sensitive projects with a team of people I trust completely. Posoti. Marcus frowned, his tactical mind immediately identifying the potential problems with her suggestion. You want to go toward your company? That sounds like running straight into the lion's den. That's exactly why it might work, Natasha explained, her voice gaining confidence as she outlined her reasoning. The syndicate has compromised the official corporate structure, but the black site operates independently from the main company. If I can reach the site commander and convince him of what's really happening, we might be able to turn the tables on these bastards. Might. It's a risk, she admitted with brutal honesty. But it's better than running blind while they hunt us down one by one like animals. Marcus considered the proposal while Luna nestled closer against his chest, drawing warmth from his body heat. The child's breathing was beginning to steady, but he could feel exhaustion taking its toll on her small frame. They needed shelter, medical attention for Natasha's injuries, and time to plan their next move properly. Most of all, they needed allies. And if Natasha was right about having people she could trust at this mysterious facility, it might be their only real chance of survival. How do we get there? He asked finally. There's an access road about 10 miles east of here. Emergency pickup protocol. If I can reach the checkpoint and identify myself properly, they'll extract us. And if you can't? Then we probably die in the snow, Natasha said with the kind of unflinching honesty that suggested she'd looked death in the face before and wasn't particularly afraid of doing so again. Marcus looked down at his daughter, who was listening to their conversation with the wide-eyed attention that meant she understood more than she was letting on. Making this choice meant putting Luna in even greater danger, but it also might be their only path to ending the threat permanently, instead of just postponing it. Okay, he said finally, the word carrying the weight of a decision that would change all their lives. We try it, but if things go wrong... They won't, Luna said quietly, interrupting him with the kind of serene confidence that only children possessed. The angels won't let anything bad happen to people who help each other. Mommy told me that, and she was always right about the important stuff. Elena's voice speaking through their daughter's innocent faith. Marcus felt tears sting his eyes as he held the two most important people in his world and prepared to lead them into an uncertain future that might hold salvation or destruction in equal measure. Behind them, the cabin where he'd once dreamed of growing old with his wife burned against the Montana sky, consuming the last physical remnants of the life they'd built together. But ahead lay possibilities he couldn't yet imagine. Dangerous possibilities, but possibilities nonetheless. As they began moving through the storm toward an uncertain future, Marcus found himself thinking about broken-winged butterflies and second chances, about the mysterious ways that tragedy and redemption often walked hand in hand through the same dark valleys. The night was far from over, and their greatest challenges still lay ahead. But for the first time since Elena's death, Marcus still wasn't facing the darkness alone. He had Luna's unwavering faith, Natasha's desperate courage, and the memory of a love that had taught him the true meaning of sacrifice. It would have to be enough. The Sterling Technologies Black Site facility materialized from the blizzard like a vision from a science fiction thriller, its existence defying everything Marcus thought he knew about corporate research installations. What had appeared to be nothing more than an abandoned mining operation beside a forgotten access road transformed upon closer inspection into something far more sophisticated and deadly. Hidden cameras tracked their approach with mechanical precision. Concealed sensors undoubtedly analyzed everything from their heat signatures to their weapons profiles. And somewhere in an underground command center, security personnel were making rapid decisions about whether the three snow-covered figures stumbling out of the storm represented salvation or annihilation. "State your identification," came a disembodied voice from speakers so well concealed that Marcos couldn't locate their source despite his training. "You have 30 seconds to comply before defensive measures are activated." Natasha stepped forward, pulling back the hood of her borrowed coat to reveal her face clearly to the hidden surveillance systems. Even injured and exhausted from their harrowing journey through the storm, she carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect from dangerous people in dangerous situations. Natasha Volkov, CEO, authorization code Delta 77 Alpha. She said clearly, her voice cutting through the wind with crisp precision. "I'm requesting emergency extraction under Protocol 7 with 2 civilians under my protection." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the wind howling through the pine trees and Luna's quiet breathing as she pressed closer to Marcus for warmth. They'd been moving through the storm for over 3 hours, following maintenance roads and game trails that Natasha somehow knew with surprising accuracy. "Authorization confirmed," the voice finally responded, carrying a note of relief that suggested whoever was monitoring them had been genuinely concerned about Natasha's safety. "Proceed to entry point Alpha. Medical team is standing by." The ground beneath their feet began to move, or rather what they'd taken for solid earth revealed itself to be an ingeniously camouflaged elevator platform capable of supporting significant weight. As they descended into the hidden facility, Marcus found himself reassessing his understanding of what Sterling Technologies actually represented. This level of secrecy and security went far beyond normal corporate research and development. The elevator opened onto a scene that looked like something from a military command center, crossed with a cutting-edge laboratory. Personnel in tactical gear moved with purposeful efficiency alongside scientists in lab coats, and every available surface seemed to display real-time data feeds from sources around the globe. This wasn't just a research facility, it was a war room. "Miss Volkov." A tall man in his 50s approached them rapidly, his face a mixture of relief and barely controlled urgency. "Thank God you're alive. We lost contact with your aircraft over 7 hours ago and feared the worst." "Commander Hayes," Natasha replied, accepting the man's steadying hand as exhaustion finally began to show through her iron composure. "We need immediate medical attention, secure communications, and a full tactical briefing. The Syndicate has moved against us directly and decisively." Hayes nodded grimly, his expression suggesting he'd been expecting this escalation for some time. "Medical team is already en route, sir." He turned to Marcos with the professional courtesy that marked him as former military. "I'm Commander Hayes' Site Security Chief. Miss Volkov's emergency transmission indicated you and your daughter provided assistance under extremely dangerous circumstances. Sterling Technologies owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." "Marcus Steele," he replied, automatically assessing Hayes with the trained eye of someone who'd learned to evaluate potential allies and threats in life-or-death situations. The man radiated competence and controlled aggression, but there was also something in his manner that spoke to genuine honor rather than corporate politics. "And this must be Luna." Hayes continued, crouching down to the child's eye level with the easy manner of someone comfortable around children. "I have a daughter about your age back home. Would you like some hot chocolate while the doctors check on everyone?" Luna nodded shyly, then looked up at her father for permission, with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. The trust and faith she placed in his decisions reminded Marquez of what was really at stake here, not just their immediate survival, but his daughter's future and her right to grow up in a world where she could be safe. "Hot chocolate sounds perfect," he agreed, his voice rough with emotions he was trying to keep under control. As they were led deeper into the facility through corridors that seemed to extend far beyond what should have been possible given the surface structure, Marcos observed everything with tactical interest. The security was impressive, multiple checkpoints, armed personnel, who moved like special operations veterans, and technology that was clearly years ahead of anything he'd encountered during his military service. But it was also obvious that this was fundamentally a defensive installation built to protect rather than to project force into the world. Whatever Natasha had built here, it was designed to be a sanctuary rather than a weapon. The medical bay they were brought to could have equipped a major trauma center. Luna was immediately taken into care by a pediatric nurse who began the gentle process of checking her for injuries while keeping her distracted with questions about her favorite books, movies, and the butterfly garden she'd mentioned wanting to plant in the spring. Natasha submitted to a more thorough examination of her head wound and other injuries sustained in the crash, though she insisted on remaining conscious and alert throughout the entire procedure. Her determination to stay aware of everything happening around them spoke to the kind of vigilance that came from years of living under constant threat. "The laceration is going to need stitches," the attending physician reported after his examination. "But there's no sign of concussion or serious internal trauma. You were extraordinarily lucky considering the circumstances." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Natasha replied, glancing toward Marcos with an expression that held gratitude deeper than words could express. "I had excellent protection when it mattered most." While the medical team worked with professional efficiency, Hayes pulled Marcos aside for a private conversation that would determine the course of everything that followed. They moved to an observation area that overlooked the main command center, where dozens of technicians monitored global communications networks and analyzed intelligence feeds in real time. "I need to understand exactly what happened out there," Hayes said without preamble, his tone carrying the weight of someone who understood that lives hung in the balance of accurate information. Volkov's aircraft went down in the middle of a severe weather event, but preliminary investigation suggests mechanical sabotage rather than weather-related system failure. "The plane was sabotaged," Marcos confirmed, his own voice taking on the clipped professionalism that marked serious tactical discussions. "And there were people waiting at the crash site before we arrived, professionals with military-grade equipment and weapons. They weren't there to rescue survivors." Hayes' expression darkened with the look of someone whose worst fears were being confirmed. "How many operatives?" "At least 8 in the initial team, probably more in reserve," Marcos replied, drawing on his training to provide accurate intelligence. "They had multiple vehicles, sophisticated tracking equipment, and coordination that spoke to serious backing. When we escaped to my cabin, they followed us there and launched a full-scale assault within hours. Your cabin was compromised." "Destroyed," Marcus said grimly, the words carrying the weight of losing the last physical connection to his life with Elena. "Along with 5 of their operatives who won't be reporting back to anyone. But there were others, and they'll keep coming until they achieve their objectives." "This is worse than we anticipated," Hayes muttered, then seemed to make a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Steele, I'm going to share classified information with you, because Ms. Volkov's life and possibly the fate of thousands of innocent people may depend on your understanding the full scope of what we're dealing with." He led Marcus to a secure briefing room where the walls were lined with displays showing global maps, corporate organizational charts, and what appeared to be surveillance photos of various individuals whose faces spoke to power, corruption, and barely concealed malevolence. 3 months ago, Ms. Volkov discovered evidence that her adopted father, Richard Sterling, had been systematically selling classified technology to unauthorized buyers. Hayes began, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd seen the consequences of such betrayals. "Not random criminals or opportunistic dealers, we're talking about state actors, terrorist organizations, and private military companies with explicitly destabilizing agendas." "The syndicate," Marcos said, pieces of the larger puzzle beginning to fall into place with terrifying clarity. "You're familiar with the term." Natasha mentioned it. She described them as a network of government and corporate insiders working together to profit from global instability and perpetual conflict. Hayes nodded with grim satisfaction. "That's an accurate, if simplified, description. What makes them particularly dangerous is their legitimate access to intelligence resources, defense contracts, and political influence at the highest levels. They can operate in plain sight because technically they're not breaking any laws that they didn't write or interpret themselves." The implications were staggering and deeply personal. Marcos had spent his military career believing he was fighting to protect American interests and global stability, only to learn that some of those very interests were fundamentally corrupt and actively working against everything he'd sworn to defend. "Where does this facility fit into the larger picture?" he asked. "This installation was established by Ms. Volkov after she inherited control of Sterling Technologies. Hayes explained pulling up organizational charts that showed the complex web of relationship between legitimate corporate structures and hidden operations. Officially, we're a research and development facility focused on defensive technologies. Unofficially, we're her attempt to build a power base independent of the corrupted corporate structure she inherited. Which is a legitimate defense technology company that actually serves the interests of peace and stability rather than perpetual conflict and maximum profit from human suffering. Hayes replied with the conviction of someone who'd found a cause worth fighting for. Everyone here has been personally vetted and recruited by me, and everyone here is loyal to her vision of what Sterling Technologies could become if freed from syndicate control. It was an ambitious goal that would require extraordinary courage to achieve, but Marcus found himself believing in the sincerity behind it. Everything he'd seen of Natasha suggested someone genuinely committed to doing the right thing even at enormous personal cost and risk. "So what's the plan now?" he asked. "That depends on what Miss Volkov decides when she's recovered enough to think strategically," Hayes replied. "But I suspect she's going to want to take the fight directly to the syndicate rather than continuing to run and hide from them." "That sounds incredibly dangerous." "More dangerous than letting them operate unchecked for another decade." Hayes challenged his eyes, reflecting the intensity of someone who'd seen too much evil disguised as legitimate business. "Mr. Steele, these people don't just threaten Ms. Volkov or Sterling Technologies. They threaten global stability and the lives of millions of innocent people. Every conflict they profit from means thousands of families destroyed. Eventually, someone has to stand up and say enough is enough." Marcus thought about his daughter sleeping peacefully in the medical bay under the protection of people who might represent humanity's last best hope against a faceless enemy that treated human lives as nothing more than entries in a profit ledger. "What would she need from me?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Hayes admitted with brutal honesty, "but I suspect that's a conversation you'll need to have with her directly and soon." They found Natasha in the facility's communications center, her head freshly bandaged and her attention focused intently on multiple data streams flowing across wall-mounted displays. She changed from her torn and blood-stained clothing into tactical gear, similar to what the facility's personnel wore, and despite her injuries, she radiated the focused energy of someone finally operating in her element. "The attack on my aircraft was coordinated with simultaneous strikes on 4 other targets," she reported as Marcus and Hayes joined her at the central console. "So they hit our main research facility in Colorado, our legal team's offices in Washington, my personal residence in New York, and Senator Morrison's investigative staff here in Montana. Casualties?" Hayes asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. 15 confirmed dead, including Senator Morrison himself and his entire team." Natasha replied, her words carrying the weight of personal responsibility for losses that were beyond her control. "They're not just trying to eliminate me anymore. They're systematically destroying anyone who might carry on this work if I'm gone." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter outside. Morrison was the senator investigating them. Morrison was chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee's Oversight Subcommittee. Natasha explained, her fingers flying across keyboards as she accessed global intelligence networks. "He'd been working with us for months to build a legal case that could actually bring criminal charges against syndicate leadership. Now he's dead, along with all the evidence his team had collected over the past year." The scope of what they were facing was becoming clearer with each revelation, and it was more terrifying than Marcus had imagined. This wasn't a business dispute or even a standard corporate conspiracy. It was a shadow war being fought between forces that operated completely outside normal legal and political channels. They've essentially declared open warfare against anyone who threatens their operations, Hayes observed with military precision. "The question is, how do we respond effectively?" "We end it," Natasha said quietly but with absolute conviction that left no room for doubt or compromise. "Tonight, before they can regroup and continue systematically eliminating everyone who knows the truth about their operations." "That's not a plan," Marcus pointed out reasonably. "That's a suicide mission dressed up as righteous anger." "Maybe," Natasha admitted with the kind of brutal honesty that suggested she'd already calculated the odds and found them wanting. "But it's the only choice we have left if we want to stop them permanently." She turned to facing him directly, and Marcus saw in her eyes the same desperate determination that had driven her to survive the crash and the subsequent hunt through the Montana wilderness. But there was something else there now, something that looked like the terrible clarity that came with accepting the ultimate sacrifice. "These people killed your wife, Marcus," she said quietly, her words hitting him like physical blows. "What?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. The experimental cancer treatment Elena received during her final months. It was based on research stolen from Sterling Technologies and sold to a pharmaceutical company controlled by syndicate interests. Natasha continued relentlessly, her voice carrying the weight of a truth she'd been carrying alone for too long. They knew the treatment was fundamentally flawed, that it would actually accelerate tumor growth, rather than stopping it, but they released it anyway, because they needed human test subjects to refine the technology for their real buyers. The room seemed to spin around Marcus as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami of rage and grief. Elena hadn't died from cancer, she'd been murdered slowly and deliberately by people who saw her life as nothing more than useful data in their pursuit of profits from human misery. 27 people died in that trial program, Natasha continued with devastating precision. 27 families destroyed so that the syndicate could perfect a biological weapon they intended to sell to the highest bidder. Your wife was just collateral damage in their pursuit of profit from death and suffering. Rage flooded through Marcus's system like molten metal, more intense and focused than anything he'd felt since Elena's death. For 3 years he'd blamed himself for not being able to save her, for not finding better doctors or more experimental treatments. To learn that her death had been deliberate, that she'd been sacrificed to advance someone else's agenda, was almost more than his sanity could process. "How do you know this?" he managed through gritted teeth. "Because stopping that biological weapons program was one of my first acts as CEO when I discovered what had been done." Natasha replied, her own voice thick with guilt and rage. "When I tried to notify the families of the victims and provide them with evidence for wrongful death lawsuits, the syndicate buried the evidence and discredited the survivors before they could seek any form of justice." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I needed you focused on keeping us alive, not consumed with thoughts of vengeance that would get us all killed," she said honestly. "But now I need you to understand what we're really fighting for. This isn't just about my survival anymore or even stopping their current operations. It's about preventing them from doing to other families what they did to yours." Hayes cleared his throat uncomfortably, his professional demeanor cracking slightly in the face of such personal tragedy. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we don't have the resources for a direct assault on syndicate leadership. Our personnel strength is less than 50 operators, and they have access to virtually unlimited government and corporate resources." "We don't need to outfight them," Natasha said, moving toward the communications console with purposeful determination. "We need to outthink them and turn their own strengths against them. And I have an idea that might just work if we're willing to take an enormous risk." She began typing rapidly, her fingers flying over multiple keyboards as she accessed systems throughout the facility and beyond. Data streams appeared and disappeared on the displays around them with dizzying speed, and Marcus caught glimpses of financial records, communication intercepts, and what appeared to be real-time surveillance footage from locations around the globe. For years, the syndicate's greatest strength has been their ability to operate in secret, Natasha explained as she worked with intense focus. Government officials who provide them with classified intelligence, corporate executives who facilitate their operations, military contractors who supply their weapons, all of them depend on plausible deniability and public ignorance. "So we take that away from them," Hayes said, beginning to understand the direction of her strategy. "Exactly. We expose everything simultaneously to multiple news organizations, law enforcement agencies, and foreign intelligence services around the world. Make it impossible for them to contain the damage or eliminate all the witnesses before the truth spreads beyond their ability to control." "They'll kill you before you can upload the first file," Marcus pointed out with brutal practicality. "Not if I'm already dead." Natasha replied with a grim smile that suggested she'd been planning this contingency for much longer than just tonight. "Commander Hayes, how quickly can your team fake my death, convincingly enough to fool their intelligence networks and surveillance systems?" "Given our resources and technical capabilities, maybe 40 minutes. Hayes said thoughtfully, his mind already working through the logistics. But once they believe you're dead, what's to stop them from just disappearing underground and rebuilding their operations somewhere else? Because the data release won't just expose their current operations. Natasha explained her plan taking shape with terrifying clarity.
It'll include financial records going back 20 years showing every transaction, every payoff, every weapon sale, and every cover-up. We're talking about evidence of crimes that will put their leadership away for life if it doesn't get them executed for treason and crimes against humanity first. It was an audacious plan that could either end the threat permanently or get them all killed in the attempt. But as Marcus thought about Elena dying slowly, while her killers profited from her suffering, he found himself caring less about the risks and more about the possibility of justice. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need you to get Luna to safety," Natasha said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone asking for the ultimate sacrifice. "There's a secure facility in Canada where Hayes can arrange for her protection until this is over. She's been through enough trauma, she doesn't need to see how this ends.
And then
I need you to help me die convincingly enough to fool people who make fooling governments their business." The plan they developed over the next hour was elegantly simple in concept and terrifyingly complex in execution. Natasha would appear to die in a carefully staged accident at the facility, complete with security footage and forensic evidence that would convince even sophisticated intelligence analysis. Meanwhile, the real Natasha would be hidden in the facility's deepest levels, while a coordinated global data dump exposed every aspect of the syndicate's operations to news organizations and law enforcement agencies simultaneously. The timing would be absolutely critical. Too early and the syndicate would have time to contain the damage before it spread beyond their control. Too late and they discovered the deception before the evidence could be distributed to enough independent sources to ensure their complete destruction. "The hardest part will be selling the death convincingly," Hayes explained as he showed them the facility's emergency protocols and self-destruct systems. "We need something that destroys enough physical evidence to explain why there's no recoverable body but leaves enough forensic traces to confirm that someone actually died. Explosion in the main computer core," Natasha suggested without hesitation. "Make it look like I was trying to destroy evidence when a power overload caused a catastrophic system failure. Classic desperate fugitive scenario that fits their psychological profile of me." "That could work," Hayes agreed after considering the implications. "We can stage it so the explosion looks like it triggered the facility's automatic self-destruct sequence. Total destruction of all computer systems and most of the upper levels." Marcus studied the facility schematics with growing unease about the human cost of their plan. "What about everyone else? Your staff won't survive an explosion like that." "They'll be evacuated beforehand under standard emergency protocols," Hayes assured him with professional calm. "Emergency procedures call for complete personnel evacuation in case of containment breach or hostile infiltration. We'll just implement those protocols a little early and more thoroughly than usual." "And afterward?" "Afterward, this facility officially never existed. My personnel disappear into new identities that have been prepared for years, and Miss Volkov becomes someone else entirely with a completely clean background." It meant giving up everything: her identity, her company, her legal status as an American citizen, and any possibility of a normal life. But it also meant the chance to actually stop the people who had killed Elena and thousands of other innocent victims around the world. "There's one more critical component," Natasha said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a request that could determine the success or failure of everything. "I need someone to trigger the data release manually from an external location. The timing has to be perfect and it has to happen after the syndicate confirms my death, but before they have time to implement new security measures." "I'll do it," Marcus said immediately without hesitation. "Marcus, no," she protested, understanding the full implications of what he was volunteering for. "You have Luna to think about. I won't ask you to—" "You're not asking," he interrupted with finality. "I'm volunteering. These bastards killed my wife, threatened my daughter, and destroyed everything I held sacred. I want to be the one who brings them down permanently." The emotion in his voice seemed to convince her because she nodded slowly with something like gratitude in her eyes. "The upload will take approximately 30 minutes from initiation. You'll be completely exposed during that entire time. If they trace the source location, they'll send everything they have to stop you."
Then we'd better make sure they don't trace it until it's too late, Marcus replied grimly. They spent the remaining time refining details and preparing contingencies for everything that could go wrong. Luna was told that they were going to play an extended game of hide and seek, where she would get to stay in a special safe place with very nice people while Daddy finished helping Natasha with her important work. The child accepted this explanation with the trusting innocence that made Marcus's heart ache, but he could see in her eyes that she understood more than she was letting on. "Will I see you again soon?" she asked as Hayes prepared to escort her to the secure transport that would take her to safety in Canada. "Very soon, little star," Marcus promised, gathering her into what might be their final embrace. "And when you do, all the bad people will be gone forever and we can go home." "To the cabin." "We'll build a new cabin," he said, thinking of the smoldering ruins they'd left behind in the mountains. "An even better one where nothing bad can ever find us again." Luna nodded solemnly with the wisdom that seemed too advanced for her years, then surprised him by turning to Natasha with a question that carried implications far beyond its simple words. "Will you help us build it?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that went far beyond carpentry and construction. Natasha knelt beside the child, her eyes bright with unshed tears that spoke to emotions she rarely allowed herself to feel. "If your daddy wants my help," she said carefully, her voice thick with hope and uncertainty, "I'd like that very much." "Yes. He wants your help," Luna said with the devastating certainty that only children possessed. "He gets lonely sometimes, even though he tries to hide it. Mommy told me to watch for that and to make sure he knows it's okay to have new friends who might become family." From the mouths of babes. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, not healing exactly, but perhaps the first stirring of possibility that healing might someday be achievable with the right person beside him. "Then it's settled," he said softly, his voice rough with emotions he was finally allowing himself to acknowledge. "When this is over, we build a new cabin together." The moment was shattered by Hayes' urgent voice over the facility's communication system. "All personnel to stations. We have multiple contacts approaching from the south and east. Looks like they've found us." "View us." Through the facility's external cameras, they could see vehicles moving through the forest with military precision, black SUVs and what appeared to be armored transport trucks. The syndicate had somehow tracked them to the black site and they were coming with overwhelming force. "How much time do we have?" Natasha asked, already moving toward the computer core where her fake death would be staged. "Maybe 15 minutes before they breach the outer perimeter." Hayes replied, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone coordinating a complex operation under extreme pressure. "This changes nothing. We stick to the plan exactly as rehearsed." But Marcus could see the fear in Luna's eyes as alarms began blaring throughout the facility. His daughter was about to watch her father disappear into mortal danger again, and this time she was old enough to understand that he might not come back. "Change of plans," he said suddenly, his protective instincts overriding strategic considerations. "I'm staying with her until she's safely away. Hayes, you handle the upload from whatever location gives us the best chance of success." "Marcus, no," Natasha protested with desperate urgency. "It has to be someone who understands military tactics and can improvise if things go wrong. Hayes is needed here to coordinate the evacuation and ensure the deception is convincing." "Then we wait," Marcus said firmly, his daughter's safety taking priority over everything else. "My child comes first always." "Your daughter's safety depends on stopping these people permanently," Natasha countered with relentless logic. "If we abort the mission now, they'll never stop hunting us. Luna will never be truly safe until the syndicate is destroyed completely." She was right, and Marcus knew it with crystal clarity that made his choice even more painful. But watching his child's frightened face as explosions began echoing from the facility's upper levels, he felt the weight of an impossible decision crushing down on him. In the end, it was Luna herself who resolved the dilemma, with the wisdom that seemed to flow through her like a gift from her deceased mother. "Daddy," she said quietly, taking his hand in both of her small ones with gentle firmness, "you have to go help Natasha stop the bad people once and for all. Mommy's angels will take care of me until you can come back safely." The faith in her voice broke his heart and mended it simultaneously, reminding him that this was Elena's final gift to their daughter, the absolute certainty that love would find a way, that people who cared about each other could overcome any obstacle if they refused to give up hope. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, little star, he whispered, holding her tight one last time. I love you too, Daddy. Now go save the world so we can build our new cabin together. As Hayes led Luna toward the escape tunnel that would carry her to safety, Marcus turned to face Natasha with grim determination and newfound purpose. Let's finish this. The explosion that destroyed the upper levels of the Sterling Technologies black site facility could be seen for miles across the Montana wilderness, a pillar of fire and smoke that painted the storm clouds in shades of orange and red. To the syndicate forces closing in on the installation, it appeared that their quarry had chosen suicide over capture-taking, with her any evidence that might have threatened their global operations. What they couldn't see was the carefully shielded lower level where Marcus still sat before a bank of quantum computers, his fingers flying across multiple keyboards as terabytes of incriminating data flowed through satellite links to news organizations, law enforcement agencies, and intelligence services on 6 continents. 30 minutes. That's how long the upload would take and how long he needed to survive the inevitable counterattack when the syndicate realized they'd been deceived by the most sophisticated intelligence operation in modern history. Beside him, Natasha, now officially dead, according to security footage that showed her being consumed by the explosion, monitored global communications as their data bomb detonated across the world's information networks with devastating precision. The BBC has it, she reported, her voice tight with anticipation and hope. So does the Washington Post, Der Spiegel, and Reuters. They're running with the story immediately, no time for the syndicate to pressure editors or threaten sources. On multiple screens around them, breaking news alerts began appearing as journalists and investigators around the world seized on the treasure trove of evidence they just received. Financial records showing weapons sales to terrorist organizations. Communication intercepts revealing coordination between government officials and criminal enterprises. Video footage of syndicate leadership casually discussing assassination contracts and biological weapons research as if they were discussing quarterly profit margins. 20% complete. Marcus reported watching progress bars crawl across his displays while monitoring security feeds showing their enemies searching the wreckage above. But we've got company moving through the ruins. Through the facility's remaining security cameras, they could see syndicate operatives moving through the destroyed upper levels, searching methodically for any sign that their target might have survived the explosion. It would only be a matter of time before they discovered the hidden access points to the lower levels. There, Natasha pointed to one of the communication intercepts scrolling past on her screen. Richard Sterling just placed an emergency call to someone identified only as Control. They know something's going seriously wrong with their plan. Marcus divided his attention between the upload progress and the tactical situation developing around them. Hayes had rigged the facility's lower levels with enough explosive charges to ensure that no evidence of their presence would survive, but triggering those charges would also cut their satellite links and abort the data transfer before completion. They were in a desperate race between information and annihilation, with the fate of countless innocent lives hanging in the balance of seconds and bandwidth. 40% complete, he announced, then tensed as new movement appeared on the security feeds. They found the primary access shaft. Professional soldiers in full tactical gear were rappelling down the emergency shaft that provided the only entrance to their hidden sanctuary. Marcus counted at least 8 figures before the camera was systematically destroyed, which meant they had maybe 3 minutes before the assault team reached their position. Can we accelerate the transfer, he asked. Not without risking data corruption, Natasha replied with frustrating honesty. If the files arrive incomplete or damaged, the evidence won't be sufficient to bring criminal charges that will stick. Then we hold them off. Benitez. Marcus moved to the weapons cache Hayes had prepared, selecting an assault rifle and enough ammunition to sustain a brief but intense firefight. The facility's lower level had been designed as a bunker with defensive positions and overlapping fields of fire that could channel attackers into kill zones, but it wouldn't hold against a determined assault indefinitely. 60% complete, Natasha called out as the first explosions echoed through the access tunnel. The Times has picked up the story. So has CNN, Fox News, and the Associated Press. It's spreading faster than they can possibly contain it now. The sound of gunfire reached them now, sharp and immediate. The assault team was systematically eliminating the facility's automated defenses and would breach their secured position within minutes. Natasha, Marcus said quietly as he checked his weapon one final time. If something happens to me, make sure Luna knows that everything we did tonight was for her and for all the other children who deserve to grow up in a world free from these monsters. Nothing's going to happen to you, she replied fiercely, her fingers never pausing in their work at the keyboards. We're both walking out of here alive to build that cabin together. 80% complete, she announced as tactical charges detonated outside their secured door. The Justice Department has issued a statement saying they're opening immediate investigations. The president is calling for emergency congressional hearings. Through the smoke and debris, Marcus could see figures moving with professional coordination advancing behind ballistic shields while covering each other with practiced efficiency. He opened fire with controlled precision, using every technique learned through years of special operations training. The defensive positions Hayes had designed worked exactly as intended, channeling the assault team into predetermined kill zones while providing excellent cover for the defender. But ammunition was finite and Marcus could hear more explosions echoing from above. Reinforcements were arriving with heavier weapons. 90% complete, Natasha shouted over the increasing gunfire. Multiple foreign governments are demanding explanations from Washington. The UN Security Council is calling an emergency session. A fresh wave of attackers pushed through the smoke, forcing Marcus to fall back to his final defensive position. His rifle was nearly empty and the tactical vest Hayes had provided was already showing multiple impact points from near misses that could have been fatal. How much longer, he called out as he reloaded behind the marginal cover of an overturned computer station. 2 minutes, maybe 3. 3 minutes might as well have been 3 hours given their current tactical situation. The assault team had identified his position and was preparing for a coordinated rush that would overwhelm his remaining defenses through sheer numbers and firepower. That's when a new sound reached them through the chaos. Not the controlled demolitions Hayes had prepared, but something much larger and more violent. The entire facility shook as massive detonations echoed from the surface, and through the din Marcus could hear something that made his heart leap with desperate hope: the distinctive roar of military helicopters and the sharp crack of professional sniper fire. Federal agents, a new voice boomed through tactical speakers powerful enough to be heard over the gunfire. This is FBI Hostage Rescue Team Alpha. Cease fire immediately and surrender or face the consequences. The syndicate assault team hesitated for a crucial moment, clearly not having expected the arrival of federal law enforcement. In that instant of confusion and uncertainty, Marcus heard the sweetest sound imaginable, Natasha's voice announcing the completion of their mission. 100% transfer complete. All files successfully distributed to every major news organization and law enforcement agency in the world. The cavalry had arrived just in time, summoned by the very evidence they'd sacrificed everything to reveal. Within minutes, FBI tactical teams were securing the facility and placing the surviving syndicate operatives under arrest while emergency medical teams attended to the wounded. As Marcus emerged from the smoke and chaos of their underground battle, his first thought was of his daughter waiting safely in Canada. Luna was secure, the immediate threat had been neutralized, and the people responsible for Elena's death would finally face justice for their crimes. But his second thought, as he saw Natasha being helped to her feet by federal agents, was of the future they might build together. A future where broken things could be healed, where second chances were possible, and where love could grow even in the ashes of unimaginable tragedy. The nightmare was finally over. The healing could begin at last. Epilogue. 6 months later. The new cabin sat in a meadow overlooking a pristine Montana lake, its log walls golden in the late afternoon sunlight of early summer. Marcus paused in his work installing the last pieces of trim around the front windows to watch Luna and Natasha working together in what would become their vegetable garden come spring. Natasha. Not Victoria Sterling anymore, and certainly not the hunted fugitive she'd been that terrible night in the storm. The woman who knelt beside his daughter, patiently explaining the difference between tomato seedlings and pepper plants, was someone entirely new. Someone who had emerged from the ashes of her former life like the mythical phoenix she'd once pretended to be. "Daddy," Luna called out, waving a small gardening trowel enthusiastically. "Natasha says we can plant strawberries over here, real ones that we can eat next summer." "That sounds perfect, little star," he called back, smiling at the pure joy in his daughter's voice. The nightmares had stopped completely months ago, replaced by dreams of butterfly gardens, secret forts, and all the normal childhood fantasies that had been temporarily displaced by their ordeal. The trials had been an international sensation, of course. 23 members of the syndicate's leadership structure were facing federal charges ranging from conspiracy to treason, and 6 former government officials had already been convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Richard Sterling himself was serving multiple life sentences for his role in the biological weapons program that had killed Elena and 41 other innocent people. Justice Marcus had discovered was a more complex emotion than he'd expected. There was deep satisfaction in seeing Elena's killers brought to account for their crimes, but also a strange emptiness where the rage had once lived. He'd spent 3 years carrying that anger, using it as fuel to keep moving forward when everything else seemed hopeless. Without it, he'd had to learn how to live again, how to find motivation in hope and love rather than vengeance and grief. "How's the carpentry coming along?" Natasha asked as she approached the cabin soil still clinging to her hands from their gardening efforts. "Almost finished," Marcus replied, stepping down from his ladder to survey their progress with quiet pride. "Should be ready for the final inspection next week. And then we officially have a home together." The word hung between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond architecture and construction. Over the past months, as they'd planned and built this new sanctuary together, they'd also been constructing something more intimate. A relationship built on shared trauma, but sustained by genuine affection, respect, and the kind of deep love that could only grow between two people who had seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay anyway. It wasn't the same kind of love he'd shared with Elena. That had been young love, passionate and all-consuming and tragically brief. What was growing between him and Natasha was something different, more measured perhaps, but also more deliberately chosen. They were both survivors now, people who had lost everything and chosen to rebuild rather than surrender to despair. "Luna asked me something interesting today," Natasha said quietly, her voice carrying undertones of hope and uncertainty. "What's that?" She asked if I was going to be her new mommy. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. They'd talked around the subject of their future together many times, but had never directly addressed the practical realities of what a permanent relationship would mean for his daughter's life. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that nobody could ever replace her real mommy, but that sometimes families grow in different and wonderful ways." Natasha replied carefully, her words chosen with obvious thought and care. "But I said that if she wanted, I could be something like a bonus mommy, someone who loved her and took care of her, but who knew that Elena would always be her first and most important mom." "And what did she say to that?" Natasha's smile was radiant with pure joy. "She said that sounded perfect because it meant she'd have an angel mommy in heaven and a here mommy on earth, and that way she'd always be protected no matter what happened." Marcus felt tears sting his eyes as he thought about his daughter's infinite capacity for love and acceptance. She'd inherited Elena's gift for finding magic in ordinary moments, for transforming potential confusion into something beautiful and meaningful through the simple power of unconditional love. "What do you think about that arrangement?" he asked quietly. "I think," Natasha said, stepping closer until they were standing almost close enough to touch, "that I'd be honored to be Luna's here mommy if you'll have me as more than just a partner in this new life we're building." "The question is whether you'll have us," Marcus replied, reaching out to take her hands in his. "We're not exactly a traditional family situation, and we come with more baggage than most people could handle. Traditional families are completely overrated," Natasha said with a laugh that held all the joy and hope he'd thought were lost forever. "Besides, I've gotten rather fond of the non-traditional life we've created together. It suits me better than anything I've ever known." He looked down at their joined hands, noting the calluses she'd developed during months of construction work and gardening. These weren't the soft hands of a corporate CEO anymore, but the strong, capable hands of someone who'd learned to build rather than just manage and control. "Natasha Steele," he said experimentally, testing how the name sounded. "How does that sound to you?" "Like a new beginning," she replied softly, her eyes bright with tears of happiness. "Like coming home after being lost for a very long time." From the garden, Luna's voice called out with urgent excitement. Come look, I think I found where the butterflies are going to live next spring. They walked hand in hand toward their daughter's discovery, a corner of the garden where wildflowers had spontaneously bloomed, creating exactly the kind of natural sanctuary that would attract the butterflies Elena had always loved. As they knelt beside Luna to examine her, Fine Marcus felt a sense of completion and peace that he thought was lost forever when Elena died. The broken-winged butterfly had learned to fly again, and in learning it had discovered that sometimes the strongest wings are the ones that have been mended with love, patience, and the unwavering faith that tomorrow can be better than yesterday. Above them the Montana sky stretched endlessly blue and filled with promise, and somewhere in that vast expanse Marcus could almost hear Elena's voice, whispering her approval of the life they were building together. A life built on the foundation of love she'd given them, but reaching toward a future that held infinite possibilities. The nightmare was over. The healing was complete. And the real story, the story of love and hope and second chances that emerged from the ashes of tragedy, was just beginning. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of love, loss, redemption, and hope. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing tales of courage and transformation.
Let us know in the comments what you thought of Marcos Luna and Natasha's journey, and share your own stories of second chances and new beginnings.